right. Welcome to the STOA, everyone. Today we have a session with Ryan Nakade. Ryan is a mimetic mediator, or at least that's what the title I'm bestowing upon him today. I think he's actually a real mediator as well, and perhaps he'll chat about his background when I take him in. And he has a cool session prepared for us today. The session is called Steel Man or Straw Man, Steel Man, and all those other men. Ryan has been kind of releasing all these cool articles called like Titanium Man, Polarity Man. And so he's going to present some of that today. We're going to have some breakout exercises to practice some of these sort of conversational heuristics that Ryan is going to present to us today. So how today's going to work, Ryan's going to do a presentation, then we're going to have some breakout rooms. And if you have any questions, there might be a Q&A portion, just put them in the chat. I'll call on you, unmute yourself. You can ask your question to Ryan or perhaps share it to the group. So that being said, Ryan, welcome back to the STOA.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Great to be here and nice to see all of you. Thank you all for coming. Hope some of these ideas I'll present will be fruitful. So I will jump right into it. Let me share my screen. Hey, can everyone see the screen? Okay. All right. So as Peter was saying, I'm going to be going over different mans and different ways we can think about modifying or working with arguments. And so the first section, we're going to cover all the ways you can kind of distort, bastardize, mess up an argument, presumably things we want to stay away from. And Peter also sent me this. This is from a book called Why We Argue. So thank you, Peter, for letting me know about this book and for sending me these definitions. So let's get the bad stuff out of the way first, okay? So we'll start with the straw man, which I'm sure almost everyone here knows what that means. Basically, a distortion of a given argument so that it is represented as worse than it was, right? So we're distorting it, we're weakening it somehow. We're not quite repeating exactly what the person said, and then we're refuting that and then pretending to have refuted what they really said, which is what makes it a fallacy. Next is the weak man, which is picking out the weakest of the opposition's arguments and refuting that, and thereby implying that this is the final word, right? So the weak man is not so much actually distorting someone's argument, but simply cherry picking the worst or weakest parts of their argument, and then refuting those weak points, pretending that you've refuted the entirety of their argument, right? So that's also something we want to be mindful of not doing. And finally, the hollow man, which I think we're seeing a lot these days, unfortunately, which is attributing a view to the opposition that not only none hold, but that there's no resemblance to views they hold. So we basically just fabricate an idea and project it onto the opposition and then pretend like they hold that view when not only do they not, but it doesn't even resemble anything that they've talked about or presented. So that's a yikes, right? Okay, so let's move in a more positive direction. We'll start with the steel man, which of course I'm sure everyone here is familiar with. It involves reinforcing the strongest aspects of one's argument and representing it as accurately as possible so that the person would agree with it. So if you were to paraphrase what they're saying and steel man adequately, they would say, yeah, that's what I'm saying. I think you got it. I think you're representing my perspective accurately. So, I think there's been a lot of emphasis in the culture on, or at least in the culture we're trying to cultivate at spaces like the STOA, of trying to really steel man people's arguments and perspectives so we're not hollow manning them or straw manning them, right, or distorting them somehow. But my ambition is to take this one step further. So I made up three mans. I call them the post-steel man modifications. The titanium man, the polarity man, and the Vajra man. And so I'll explain what each of these are, and then we'll have an exercise, a breakout room to kind of try that as a group. We won't have time to get to the Vajra man today, but Peter said I should at least mention it. I did write an article on the Vajra man on Medium, so maybe that can be linked in the video somehow. So we'll start with the titanium man, see what that is. So I think of the titanium man as an upgraded steel man. So instead of just repeating the argument in the same way that the person articulated it, we're actually going to take it a step further and add more complexity, nuance, context, perspectives, and variables into the argument. We're going to make it more robust. We're going to make it more complex. We're going to make it more inclusive and sophisticated. So this usually involves up-translating ideas, right? Or retranslating them, remixing ideas with other ideas and reinterpreting them so we can derive new insights and new meanings and come to new perspectives on any kind of idea or meme that's floating around in the noosphere today. So let me give a few examples. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Hanzi's, this is from the Listening Society. So Hanzi has a section in this book where he runs different arguments or perspectives through different developmental stages, and each stage is progressively articulated in a way that's more complex and nuanced and refined than the previous stage. But I'm just going to go through so he did this in 4 steps, but I'm just going to go from step 1 to step 4, right? Step 4 being the Titanium Man rendition of an argument. So for the conservative argument, he says the Arabic, this is like the lowest level, right? The Arabicness inherent to Arabs gives them traits that are irreconcilable with Western civilization. It's a bit of a yikes, right? Kind of essentializing a certain group there. So this is the highest level of the same conservative argument as it, oh, sorry. How do I go back? I clicked something. Okay, so he says liberal values, let me close this. Liberal values prevalent in Western countries may be more functional in late modern society than the more traditionalist values of many Arab Muslims. For successful integration of these different cultures, one must take this perspective of all parties seriously, right? But it's a little bit, you can see how it's the same topic being talked about. It's a conservative argument addressing kind of immigration or cultural tensions regarding groups from different cultures or different regions of the world, but it's articulated in a much more inclusive, kind of integrative and complex level. One more example of a green argument, right? So this is kind of his lowest level argument. Human greed causes crises and destroys the environment. So we're going to Titanium Man that. He says, the logic inherent to the economic system is fundamentally alien to the logic of the ecosystems of the many biotopes. This means that there is no self-regulating feedback cycle directly present between our economic and technological expansion and the ecosystems upon which we depend. This lack of feedback means that we have to drive the ecosystem to collapse before the market self-adjusts. We must thereby create some other feedback, example by means of policy, public awareness, or cultural development, right? So again, he brings in other perspectives, right? Public awareness, cultural development, feedback loops from the system's perspective, et cetera, kind of really flesh out and have a more complex rendition of that line of green argumentation. One more, I have to throw in the feminist argument, right? Level 1, feminist argument. Feminism means to stand up for women and crush the patriarchy. Yay. Now let's go to the highest level. Feminism is an interest group movement as well as a social justice movement. As an interest group movement, it must be weighed against other interests and perspectives. As a social justice movement, it must be coordinated with other social justice issues such as class, ethnicity, global inequality, other gender issues, including men's issues, and the exploitations of animals and nature. Okay, so here are some other Titanium Man examples I'll just give of articles that I thought were applying the Titanium. So the first one is why modern Buddhists should take reincarnation seriously by Aeon, was circulating in some of the meta communities I'm in. And that's a very interesting kind of reformulation of what reincarnation means in Buddhism, right? Not as maybe a literal, passing of one consciousness or soul from one body to another throughout cycles of life and death and rebirth, but actually positing a new emergent ontology of interconnection and non-otherization. Very interesting. Brent Cooper has an article called Systemic Conspiracy, which is a very interesting way of kind of rethinking conspiracy and conspiracy theory, right? Not just a kind of literalistic tinfoil hat, paranoid way of thinking of conspiracy that I think a lot of people associate conspiracy thinking to be, but a much more complex, systemic, socio-historical form of critical analysis of society and conspiratorial dynamics that could be emergent, right? Jordan Hall calls this emergent conspiracy, or at least something similar to what Brent is talking about. And also plug my own article as just another example. I call it Diaphanous Anti-Racism, which is basically mixing kind of anti-racist or social justice ideas with Gebser's integral philosophy. So just another kind of playing with different ideas to create more holistic, more sophisticated renditions of certain arguments, perspectives, or ideas. So let me articulate some of what I see as the benefits of Titanium Man, or at least what I'm trying to kind of promote in by sharing this idea today, right? So I think first, it helps us to overcome triggers and allergies that we may have, because from what I've observed, allergies often involve holding straw mans or kind of like low resolution versions of an idea in our head and then getting mad at the lower, the less complex version of that idea, right? So if we can change our association with a certain idea by upgrading it via the titanium man, it can help to overcome some of our reactions that we may have, negative reactions. Second involves what Maria Popova calls combinatorial creativities, and where we can break through what I'm calling memetic functional fixedness. So the definition of functional fixedness that I really like is this is from Wikipedia. Functional fixedness is a cognitive bias that limits a person to use an object only in the way it is traditionally used. And so I think of memetic or maybe ideological functional fixedness as getting fixated on the meaning of an idea as it's traditionally understood. So how can we kind of repurpose old ideas and see things in new ways, right? Regenerate them, recreate them, and re-energize them at new levels. I think the third benefit is the reframed argument, the titanium man argument, is often less polarizing and more palpable or even embraced by rival memetic camps, right? So the more, like if you think of some of those examples Hanzi gave, with like the Arabicness with the Arabs, or feminism has crushed the patriarchy, right? These kind of less nuanced presentations of arguments tend to have a more polarizing and divisive impact. And so when we recreate the perspective, I think it's more easily embraced by people who might have an allergic reaction or feel oppositional towards the less complex incarnation of that argument. Fourth, I think it allows us to connect with more people, including ones we disagree with or even despise. And I think of this as finding common ground versus building higher ground, right? So I teach dialogue workshops to the public, and something I often hear is, I can't find any common ground with the other side. And so I think the titanium man helps us to creatively build higher ground where we can meet people on a level that we currently can't meet them at by recreating the idea in a higher fashion. That makes sense, right? So if you can't find common ground, build higher ground together. Fifth, radical inclusion, right? It's a tool where we can address divisive and polarizing topics at a higher, deeper, more nuanced and complex level. Now, I think this is important for communities like ours, because I think if certain ideas, right, that are being weaponized in the culture war might be very polarizing and divisive and inflammatory in the way that they're currently represented and spoken about. But I think the other trap is we just end up ignoring certain ideas instead of trying to really interrogate them for whatever truth or value or beauty or goodness they have in them, and then upgrading them to a higher level. And therefore we can talk about it and sense make around with these ideas in a way that's not polarizing and not divisive, but we're still connecting with the idea, right? So in some ways we're bridge building here. So I think that's something I'm interested in trying to promote with this idea. And finally, my hope is to give communities deliberate sense-making tools to practice up-translating and complexifying ideas deliberately and consciously. I think a lot of people already intuitively understand what I'm trying to get at with this titanium man idea. And I'm just trying to give it a name, right, coin and neodualism, and make it a thing so that we can start to consciously explore how to upgrade ideas to new heights. So how do we do this? Step one, we find any idea, meme, or argument. Now, step two, this is really important. It's a distillation process where we try to extract core themes, principles, values, or lines of critique from that idea or perspective, right? And sometimes in order to find the truth or value of a certain perspective, you need to abstract and generalize it a bit. So I think of this process in two steps. One is noting what the affirmative value or argument the perspective is promoting, right? So socialism could be promoting something like equality, right? Libertarianism could be promoting a political system valuing autonomy and liberty. And then, of course, there's what the perspective is critiquing. So socialism could be critiquing capitalism, inequality, right? Unhelpful economic hierarchies. And libertarianism may be critiquing government, force, tyranny, right? All the ways the government could F something up. And so either the affirmative value or the critique, I think, has some, even if just an ounce of truth perhaps in it, and that's worth kind of expanding and exploring. So after you kind of distill perspective into those different, into those different categories, we can expand the context or parameters of the argument and then bring in additional memes, perspectives, variables, and values, right? So this is where we are remixing the idea with other ideas and then kind of creating a synthesis in step 4, where we synthesize these ideas into a new one that has a new concept or meaning structure to it, right? We create a new association with that idea, like systemic conspiracy or reincarnation with the Aeon article, right? And then the final step, which I like to do, just to kind of see how this lands with people, right? Just to share with people from all over the political spectrum and see how they react to it and see if their reaction to it is as strongly as to the version of it that they didn't like, or if it's an idea that they hold. Do they resonate with my new Titanium Man version of the idea? So the phrase I usually use when sharing my Titanium Man rendition of their perspective is, this is how I've been thinking about what you're saying. Let me share with it. I want to hear your feedback. All right, let's play. So I'm thinking for this, we can do breakout rooms of 4. I'm thinking 15 minutes. And then together as a group, everyone will Titanium Man 2 memes. I went for tried to really go for some inflammatory ones. MAGA and white fragility. So see what you can do with those 2 ideas. So in each group of 4, pick one person to record the Titanium Man, and then you can share what you came up with the main group. So one person can kind of be a scribe and just kind of track down what kind of Titanium Man reframes you came up with for those 2 ideas. And remember, there are no right or wrong answers, right? It's really an exercise in creativity. So don't get fixated on, is this true, is this not true, right? Just try to think outside of the box, break through that mimetic functional fixedness, kind of like brainstorming, right? Maybe withholding some judgment and just really trying to creatively rethink some of these meanings of these ideas while still retaining kind of the core line of argumentation that each of these ideas of MAGA and white fragility are trying to get at, if that makes sense. So should we give it a crack, Peter?
Yeah, so want me to put them in for 50 minutes for people, right?
All right, well, thank you for the feedback and for humoring me with that exercise. Thinking if there's nothing more, we can move on to the Polarity Man. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Great, so Polarity Man is a technique derived from Barry Johnson. He calls this polarity management. So the polarity man is also play on management, like for short, right? And basically it sees that all arguments or perspectives represent one side of a larger interdependent polarity, right? So some polarity examples would be like inhalation versus exhalation, private versus public, liberal, conservative, theory, praxis, that kind of thing. And so the idea is that any kind of argument, perspective, or idea tends to represent one side of a polarity. And so we're trying to excavate the larger whole, the larger polarity space that any perspective is. It's constant, right? So we're subsuming a one-sided perspective into a larger whole by fleshing out what its opposite, equal but opposite and interconnected polarity is. I also think of polarity manning as a form of shadow work, where we're actually being able to see the opposite perspective that any perspective in our dualistic universe conjures into reality, and then mapping the positives and negatives about that. So here are some examples, right? So if someone says traditions are irrational and oppressive, that's one side of a polarity where traditions are being critiqued, maybe from a progressive perspective, right? And so the polarity here is kind of like preservation versus transformation, or past versus future. So we've taken an argument or a phrase that is kind of one-sided, and we've neutralized it into a polarity, where this can still have some truth to it, but it's not the whole picture, right? Another one is diversity is divisive and destabilizes the country. So here is a tension being explored between maybe unity and diversity, or difference and sameness, right? Exploration versus exploitation is another one from like complexity theory, where instead of just saying, well, diversity certainly has its downsides, right? There's still the opposite polarity of unity or sameness or whatever that's usually conjured in contrast to diversity. So this makes it a little confusing. So let's get into some actual examples. So we'll take this polarity of difference and sameness. And what's cool about the polarity technique is that each side of the polarity, as you can see, has virtues, and each side has a shadow side, right? So if we look at difference, here are some of the benefits of emphasizing difference, right? There's diversity, which can be very beautiful. We have more perspectives. It can be very energizing to have diverging perspectives, right? It can have creative emergent insights come out of that ecology of difference. But then there's a shadow side of going too far on the difference end of the polarity, right? It can become divisive, right? We may lose connection or common ground. It can have a very destabilizing effect, right? Then there's the virtue of the sameness side, right? Where there's a unity, there's a oneness, we find similarities and celebrate those similarities, commonalities, we find solidarity with each other, all very kind of nice and connective and cohesive. But then the shadow side, it could be boring, right? We're lacking creativity. We may miss out on other viewpoints or perspectives. We can have less resilience, kind of like monocropping or monocultures, right? Where too much of the same thing creates fragility in the system. So so not only, so we start with one art side of polarity, we flesh out its equal and opposite side, and then we chart the virtues and shadows of both polarities. So we really get the whole picture here, right? So I find this a very helpful exercise. Oh, I think I skipped this slide. So here are some of the benefits of doing this. You see the greater whole that our arguments are embedded in, including the benefits in the shadow sides. Going from one kind of getting locked into one perspective, seeing the larger whole. This is a Barry Johnson insight that some problems are unsolvable, meaning there's no one-off solution to the problem. So instead, we have to think about how to manage that tension skillfully forever, right? How do we manage a tension like yin and yang, masculine, feminine? There's no answer to it. It's that polarity is always going to be there. But how do we oscillate between the polarities, given that we can't avoid them, and highlight the benefits and stay away from the drawbacks, right? How do we get the best of yin and yang? How do we get the best of masculinity, femininity? How do we get the best of liberal, conservative, whatever, knowing that tension is always going to be there. So it's not a one-time synthesis of opposing forces, right? But an eternal oscillatory process between them. And also, I think it's a great mediation and depolarization tool for pretty obvious reasons, right? We're able to kind of diffuse very charged tensions by fleshing out the entire polarity space. So again, instructions, find any argument, idea, meme, or perspective, and then we map the polarity space. So the first step is to find the pole for the argument of the side that you chose, and then determine its opposite pole. So this usually requires some level of abstracting and generalizing, right? So if you have a specific idea, let's take maybe taking on a spot here. Let's take like the MAGA example we just talked about, right? So MAGA would be one side of the polarity, and it would have an upside and a downside, right? So maybe the polarity would be something like country, right, or homeland or something, and then the opposite pole could be like globalism or something more inclusive that usually kind of generated as the oppositional point in the culture war. And then you'd find what the themes are for each side of the polarity. That's not exactly the same at the same object level as the content that your polarity meant, right? So again, with MAGA, it could be like tradition, it could be looking to the past, right? It could be any of these more general themes. And then you map the upsides and downsides of that theme, and then upsides and downsides for the opposite polarity. So this is a really powerful process that's been Barry Johnson used with groups in real deep conflict, because to even generate the polarity takes a lot of mediation work to get people to agree on what the polarity actually is, right? And this is the fourth and most important point when doing this, is that the polarity has to be framed neutrally. So both sides of the polarity are interdependent and equal. And so we're avoiding like hierarchical judgments like good, evil, right versus wrong, healthy and sick, where one pole is clearly superior to the other one. We want to avoid that, right? We want to take a situation that might be very polarizing and reframing it to be an equal, neutral polarity. So right, wrong is not neutral, right? But left, right, maybe. Healthy, sick is not neutral. Healthy is better than sick, but past and future is neutral, right? So there's that abstraction and neutralizing effect there. Sorry, that might have been a little bit less clear than I wanted to initially articulate this. But so instead of practicing in a breakout room for with one side of an argument, I'm going to give a situation, which is the Israel-Palestine conflict. So can we map out the polarity spaces of the Israel-Palestine conflict? And again, just one more explanation. The polarity, the group that you're going to be in, when you do this exercise, it probably won't be, Israel and Palestine will probably not be the poles, right? There's a deeper tension, a deeper force thematically or philosophically underneath is the nation states of Israel and Palestine that are in tension. So the step is to determine what the two poles are underlying that conflict, and then the virtues and shadows of each of those poles. So let me stop sharing the screen.
And just a timing clarification, because we're at the top of the hour. We're here 90 minutes in total. Was that the thing? Okay, cool.
I think so. We may not need the full time, but yeah, I think so.
Okay. Looks like we're back, Ryan.
All right, welcome back, folks. And again, if you all want to share your team's polarity reframe of the Israel-Palestine conflict and share that in the chat, go ahead and drop that in the chat. And does anyone want to unmute and share what the polarity you generated was? Or several, maybe?
Sure. Something pretty interesting came up for our group. The polarity that we were working with was it was just two words. One pole stay, the other pole go. And so as for the virtue of going, of wandering out, of leaving home, we came up with, you're exploring, you're meeting new perspectives. Maybe you're acting with courage, and then the virtue of staying home is something like a solidarity with your group, or kind of a safety, knowing who you are and where you are. And then the shadow of staying is maybe home is getting crowded, and maybe it's reaching its carrying capacity. Maybe you're staying because you've become kind of complacent. Maybe you just don't want change, you're afraid of change. And then the shadow of going, wandering, is, I have here, acquiescing to external demands. So kind of doing something not because you know it's right, but because other people are saying you should. And another shadow could be, say you have certain responsibilities and obligations at home, and you just want to abandon all that and escape from it, so you just leave. So we had a lot of fun with that.
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing. Very interesting. Yeah, always a original way for me of looking at these things. So that's great, Jay. Thank you. Maybe one more. Anyone else want to share what you came up with or what the process was like? I see Evan raising her hand.
So we actually came up with a polarity that we were looking for something where it wasn't like positive or negative, like you had said. So we came up with the polarity of the sort of like letting people, like having people in some local area work out borders between themselves versus like the international community stepping in and drawing borders. We thought that was an interesting root of this. And so we came up like that was cool because we were able to come up with, like, in your quadrants, like positives and negatives for all of those, for both sides of that. And that I think was an interesting way of looking at it, for sure.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Well, there's nothing else. Thank you for trying these things out with me and for entertaining some of these ideas. And I hope it was an interesting experience. And again, I'd love any feedback from anyone at another time about different ways these ideas or group activities could be improved or refined at all. So yeah, Peter, thank you for inviting me today.
Yeah, thank you for coming, my friend. Were you going to tease us? There's like a third man that you said you're going to like hint at. I don't know.
Sure. So the vibe thing, I mean, one is I didn't have time to do it today. Also, I don't know how to actually turn it into a group exercise, but basically the idea is taking it's the same thing where it's basically, I call it the right-brained, like Titanium Man. So it's taking any kind of idea, theme, meme, etc., and redoing the symbolic or aesthetic presentation of the idea, and thinking about changing the mood or state of consciousness that idea evokes within people who imbibe the idea, right? So you're kind of tinkering with the aesthetic presentation of it and combining it with remixing it with a new aesthetic or symbolic structure, or even articulating the idea from a completely different state of consciousness altogether. So it's kind of like the psychedelic Titanium Man, basically. I don't know how to create an exercise for that, at least not virtually.
Awesome. Maybe that's something that the collective intelligence here at the STOA could figure out. So Ryan, thank you so much for coming to STOA. We'll plug some other events coming up. Tomorrow we have some really cool events. Alanja Forsberg is going to come in with the virtue of surrender. She does this thing called, I think, Avalon, and a lot of interesting kind of people. They speak really highly of her sort of like kind of spiritual abilities. So I'm quite excited for her to come in. And then we've got our boy Daniel Schmachtenberger coming in at 6 p.m. Talking about a health index. Susan Campbell, I don't know if I want if I'm cool to put you on the spot, but you have an event coming up in the STOA. Would you like to talk about it briefly?
Yes, mine will be on July 12th, 9 a.m. Pacific time, noon Eastern, and it's on practices for authentic living. So I will be looking at how people get taken out of being present to what is, all the things that get in the way of being present. And I'll perhaps do some self-awareness activities with us. And I'll put that in a larger context of systems theory and human evolution.
Beautiful. Yeah, if you haven't read Susan's book, I highly recommend it. And she's having a new one, I think, launched in August. So I'm excited for that. So yeah, everyone can check out the events on thestoa.ca. And thank you everyone for coming out today.